Say hello. Good evening. Welcome to the opening event of the third season of the Israel Association of Writers in English Zoom uh, series. Because tonight I'm really happy to hear about this subject from a very different perspective, from a very different angle. Two Israeli writers who live abroad and write in English, Ayelet Tsabari and Omer Friedlander. Let me just introduce them very briefly, and then they will take over. Ayelet Tsabari moved to Canada in her 20s and has been winning fiction awards ever since there for The Art of Leaving and The Best Place on Earth. Ayelet teaches at the MFA program in creative writing at the University of Guelph, and also at the Shane D. Rudolph graduate track in creative writing at Bar-Ilan. If you really want to know more about Ayelet after tonight, you can meet her at Tel Aviv University on May 11th, giving the annual Carmel lecture. So you can find out much more about her. Omer is more secretive. Omer Friedlander was born in Jerusalem, grew up in Tel Aviv, earned a BA in English literature from the University of Cambridge, England, and then an MFA from Boston University, where he was supported by the Saul Bellow Fellowship. His short stories have won numerous awards, and they've been published in the United States and Canada, France, Israel, and I hope you're all on mute, because I'm going on it very shortly, because as they take over. Omer currently lives in New York. Ayelet, you'll tell us about it. Why don't we begin with Ayelet, who is going to read for us, and then Omer, and then we'll talk, and then they'll talk, and we'll all discuss this issue that I think really interests all of us, writing in English about Israel.
Thank you so much, Karen, and thank you all for being here. I'm really glad to be here because, frankly, I don't know how I kind of missed the existence of this group, which should be a perfect fit for me. I do live in Tel Aviv now. I live in IAWE. I moved back 4 years ago after 20 years in Canada. So I have kind of both perspective, I guess, at this point. And yeah, I'm going to leave the talking for a conversation, which I think would be more interesting. But I'm going to read actually from the short stories because I felt like it was a better match for Omer today, whose book of short stories I also happen to have here. And I'm going to read from mine, which is The Best Place on Earth. It's going to be 10 years in next year. I can't believe that happened. And I'm going to read from a story called The Poets in the Kitchen Window, just the beginning, just the beginning of it. No preamble needed. The missiles started falling on Tel Aviv on the night of January 17th. A few hours after Operation Desert Storm began in Iraq. They had been prepared, carrying their gas masks with them everywhere for weeks. Cardboard boxes with dangling straps like purses, which some girls in Uli's class had decked out with stickers and collages. At school, they had run drills with everyone sitting in a row on the floor, leaning against the wall, elbowing each other and giggling. None of them had ever sat in shelters, had ever even heard a siren. The only war in their lifetime had been the Lebanon War, which erupted in 1982 when Uri was 4 and had never really ended. From images he saw on the news, Uri knew that people up north had sat in shelters. New soldiers had died, even a classmate's brother. But in Ramat Gan, the suburban town where he lived, hours away from the border, it was sometimes easy to forget. When the first siren sounded, Uri thought it was a part of the dream. He had been dreaming about wars a lot lately. Dreams where he was taller and braver and Ashkenazi, his skin lighter, his eyes blue, like one of those black and white pictures of soldiers he had seen in history books, tears glistening in their eyes after they'd liberated Jerusalem. As Uri watched the sepia movies his teacher had screened in history class, the stiff, clownish, fast-moving soldiers waving from tanks and marching in the streets, he wished he had been born earlier, back before independence, when the pioneers had built kibbutzim and paved roads and rebelled against the British, when soldiers cried at the Wailing Wall and there was a purpose, a greater meaning, a larger battle. It seemed like everything of significance had happened before he was born. In his last year of elementary school, he had written a poem about it, titled Other Wars, which had won his school poetry contest, earning him publication in the school paper and a month of mockery from the boys in his grade, who recited parts of it with a lisp and substituted the word fag every time war appeared in the poem. That first night, Uri sat on his parents' bed with his dad, their gas masks pressing red marks around their faces. Uri had fastened the straps so tight that his chin ached. They had sealed the room a few days earlier, covering the windows with heavy-duty plastic sheeting and duct tape like the IDF had instructed on TV. The mask smelled of rubber, like a new toy, and Uri could hear his breathing as though he were underwater. Then the first missile hit, and Uri's heart lurched in his chest like a jerked knee. His father, looking like a frightened giant ant, wrapped his arm around him and pulled him closer. 5 or 6 more explosions echoed in the distance, sounding like fireworks on Independence Day, or a fighter jet that had broken the sound barrier. And then one more, closer this time. The 7th floor apartment walls shuddered with the reverberation. Uri's body was tense, his jaw clenched. But it was the kind of fear that put things into proportion, making every other fear he'd ever felt, of failing a test in school, of jumping headfirst into the swimming pool, of embarrassing himself in front of Avital Ginsburg, back when he used to like her, which he no longer did, seemed trivial. It was the kind of fear that made him stronger, a man. The following day, Yasmin called. It was a cool, sunny morning, the air as crisp as broken glass, and Uri and his father sat on the couch in their living room, watching the IDF spokesman on TV. The missiles had fallen in and around Tel Aviv, the spokesman said. None of the missile heads was chemical and there were no casualties. He urged everyone to stay at home and keep calm. Then they cut to shots of panicked crowds lining up at Ben Gurion Airport. I'm coming home, Yasmin said. The line crackled and her words echoed faintly. Uri's heart gave a little start, surprise, delight, anticipation. When, he said, turning away from his father's outstretched arm. His dad reached over and pried the phone out of his hand. Don't come, he said. Everyone is leaving. If we had a place to go, we'd be leaving too. I'm coming. Uri could hear his sister's voice on the other line. And that's that. Thank you. I'll stop here and let Omer read from his wonderful book.
Thanks. I really love that story. I remember reading it for the first time. It's great to be here, and thanks for coming to listen. So I'll read just the opening from my from the first story in my collection called Jaffa Oranges. We are a fruitful, many-branched and sprawling family. ranging from Yafo to Haifa, and our business is oranges. I will be 87 at the turn of the new millennium, and I own one of the last true Shamuti orange groves, where the fruit is sweet and thick. My 4 children, 3 sons and a daughter, work in finance and law, and my grandchildren, all 9 of them, can't tell the difference between a Shamuti and a Mandarin. From time to time, they come visit the grove in Asharon, help pick the fruit, wrap it individually in wax paper, and pack it in crates, which are later sold at the farmer's market. I'm always reminded of a poem by Yehuda Amichai when I think of my children and my grandchildren. It's called Eyes, and I know it by heart. My eldest son's eyes are like black figs, for he was born at the end of the summer. And my youngest son's eyes are clear, like orange slices, for he was born in their season. And the eyes of my little daughter are round like the first grapes, and all are sweet in my worry. And the eyes of the Lord roam the earth, and my eyes are always looking round my house. God's in the eye business and the fruit business. I'm in the worry business. When I stumble across the young woman wandering around the grove, I'm preparing for the spring. Since dawn, I've been clearing out the unripe fruit clogging the irrigation canals. I'm wearing my tembel hat, its brim hardly covering my large ears, which stick out. My movements are slower than they used to be. The woman, wearing a button-down blouse, billowing beige pants and sandals, is accompanied by one of my workers, an Arab man who guards the grove, whose hands are always clean and spotless, fingernails clipped and neat. The woman does not seem surprised to see me. In fact, she's been looking for me. She's starkly beautiful with radiant olive skin, dark tumbling curls, and black eyes under unusually large lids. She tells me she's the granddaughter of my childhood friend, Khalil Haddad, a Palestinian whose father owned one of the largest orange groves in Jaffa during the British Mandate. I can see the resemblance immediately in her eyes. He had the very same ones, dark as coal, heavy-lidded. I tried to control my breathing as we walked through the grove, the light golden on the plump fruit. Her hands cradle the oranges. She presses her ear to them, as if they might whisper a secret. What does she know? What has Khalil told her? My heartbeat is rapid, my hands shake. I have not spoken Khalil's name aloud for years and years. None of my grandchildren know his name. The soft grass is spotted with fallen fruit. Buzzing bees flit from purple lemon flowers to white lime flowers. Laila explains that Khalil told her about me, his devoted childhood friend, his only Jewish friend, countless times. When her grandfather died several months before, she decided to come here to ask me about him. She loved him very much, but she feels like she doesn't know much about his past in Palestine before he lived in London, before the war, before Nakba. It wasn't an easy trip for me, Laila says. Despite her British passport, she tells me that she was interrogated by the border control officers for hours at the airport. And what did you tell them? That you were just going to talk to an old man about his oranges? It doesn't matter what I told them. I am Palestinian, so they were suspicious. I think I'll stop there. Thanks.
I think we need more. We need more of that story.
Yeah, I could read a little more, or we could start the conversation. But yeah, we can read a little more later.
Yeah, I read a couple more paragraphs or another page, I would say. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. We can definitely read some more. I never saw Khalil after he departed with his family. So many Palestinians fled by sea and land after the heavy bombardments of Jaffa. The port was overwhelmed with refugees crowding small boats. The Haddad family, like the other orange growers, dismantled their water pumps, and deserted their grove, carrying with them only a small portion of their belongings in handcarts. Jaffa was burning, the trees in the orchard were burning, the oranges were burning, and the flames spiraled up into the sky, and for days, ash floated in the air, blanketing the abandoned city in a haze. I don't like to think back to those moments. Khalil and I packed the oranges together into crates in your great-grandfather's orchard. We wrapped each orange individually in wax paper. I pick an orange and withdraw a pocket knife, flick the blade open. The blade glints in the sun, and I see my own face reflected in it, splotched with cancer spots in a sprinkling of veins like the rootstocks of a tree. Without noticing, I've grown old. Rot sets quickly in an orange, infecting the entire fruit. The trick is to squeeze it firmly and listen to its sound. You can tell by the fermented smell that it's spoiled. But the orange in the palm of my hand is young, unblemished. I dissect it, peeling the thick skin in one long curly slab, and offer her the naked fruit, coated in porous, bitter white tissue. She eats a segment, juice spilling down her chin, and spits out a pip. I thought Jaffa oranges were meant to be seedless, she said. At the time, for a Jew like me to be friends with a Palestinian like Khalil wasn't so strange. Under Ottoman rule, Jews and Palestinians carted sand together to make cement, toiled in orange groves and vineyards, tinkered in metalwork factories, ran seaside brothels, and oversaw the Bride of the Sea's crown jewel, Jaffa Harbor's booming export business, fleets of cargo vessels sailing around the world carrying citrus fruit. When Palestine changed hands from the Ottomans to the British, my life remained mostly unchanged. As a child, I spent most of my time in the packing house with Khalil, wrapping oranges and packing them in crates. It was a good job, monotonous but not difficult. Every morning, I walked with Khalil to the packing house, past the newspaper vendor selling copies of Palestine, and Abu Lafia's bakery, where phyllo pastries were baking in large stone ovens, stopping by Abu Ahmad's, the tiny sweet shop, a favorite spot for khalva for many years before it burned down. Camels ambled lazily through Clock Square, their hooves clicking on the cobblestones. Khalil's father and the other landowners sat under the shade of palm trees in elegant white suits, drinking coffee from small glasses. Tell me about my grandfather, Lila says. Her voice is excited, like a little girl waiting to open a present. Her eyes, Khalil's eyes, gleam. I think I'll stop there. Thank you.
Nice.
Thank you both. That was quite amazing. I understand that my microphone makes a lot of noise, so I keep getting muted. So, but I do want to tell you, all of us, everyone in the audience, was moved by what you're, by both of your stories, by both of your memories, stories. They seem so true. How is it, though, that you came to write them in English when the experiences are clearly in Hebrew?
who should go first?
Go first, I guess. Ayelet.
Okay, I will. Wow. Every time I'm asked that, and clearly I'm asked that often, it's like, you know, I have so much to say, and for a moment I don't know how to even start or what to say. I understand that it's an odd thing. I'm aware of it, you know. I don't think it's something that I planned or imagined that I would do or wanted to do, really. I always knew I wanted to write. I had no doubt that was, you know, my passion from a very young age. I was writing since I was like 5. You know, I always wanted to write. I always loved stories. But when I moved to Canada, I was 25. And at first I just fell into this, like, you know, I say sometimes it's like the gap between the languages. I just didn't know how to express myself in English well enough, but I wasn't using Hebrew. You know, when I moved to Canada, it was also time before when phone calls were expensive, when social media didn't exist. So there wasn't an easy way for me to use Hebrew at all. I didn't know Israelis around. So suddenly I was kind of thrusted into a life in English that I wasn't ready for. And whether you like it or not, when that happens, your mother tongue also can atrophy, even if you don't use it. And that's what started to happen for me. And I guess a few years later, English started making itself known in my writing. And it wasn't even really writing, it was kind of like journal, diary entries, just like some thoughts, like some fragmented stuff, because I again still couldn't imagine that I would ever take on something as big as writing in my second language. I'm trying to make this short because it's a long story. But I think, yeah, so first English kind of started to appear. And as it happened, I started to fall in love with it, with the newness of it, and distance it afforded me. And the reinvention and the anonymity, and all of that. So yeah, so I'll start there kind of, because obviously I can just talk about it for the entire, for the remaining 40 minutes. So I'm gonna hear from you a little bit, Omer. I'm curious to know your journey too.
Yeah, I think in some ways it's pretty similar, and I think like you, it wasn't so much a choice, but it felt like it kind of happened. I was actually, the first time I met Ayelet a couple months ago, it was really fun, and it was also special for me because I feel like I never really met anyone who was writing about Israel in English. So I didn't really feel part of the scene here in New York with American Jewish writers, because I'm Israeli, and I didn't feel so much part of the scene in Israel where they're writing in Hebrew. So it was really nice to share kind of our experience of it and commiserate a little about our weird place. But I think also it gives me some distance. I think I noticed it, obviously retrospectively, it wasn't planned, but it does give me some distance because writing about a place that's so familiar, I think you need distance in order to make it new on the page, and to make something that seems taken for granted, the landscape even, the people, and to make it something that you see it with fresh eyes. So I think writing in English is a way to do that. In Hebrew, it's more difficult because it's my mother tongue, and because I spent most of my childhood in Israel, and it would be difficult to see it with new eyes, I think. And yeah, I think my journey was similar in a way. I did spend a couple years in Princeton in New Jersey when I was a kid, and that's where I learned English. So I was 6 years old maybe, and it made me think of it because of your story a little bit, because it's not the same time period exactly, but it was the first time I took a bus. So because of the Intifada and stuff like that, I didn't really get on buses in Israel when I was a kid. So when I was 6, I remember taking the bus for the first time in New Jersey, and I was really excited. And yeah, so I think after spending those years in the States, where I didn't feel like I belonged so much, I think I remember mostly I didn't speak English at first, obviously, and I remember not understanding what they wanted from me. they we would recite the Pledge of Allegiance every day in the class, and I didn't know, what it
You
was.
would probably like it warmer, though.
Uh, and I remember not knowing what it was and not saying it. So I was sort of punished and sent to the corner where there was a table with an aquarium with hermit crabs. And I remember not knowing it was a punishment and really liking it, with the hermit crabs. So I think some of my first feelings were feelings of being a stranger and not belonging. And maybe that's part of the reason why I write in English about Israel, because when I came back to Israel, I also felt a bit strange, because now I'd spent some time in the States. So both places are kind of strange for me in some ways.
No.
I think you're muted. Okay. We still
You're
can't.
still muted, Karen.
We can't hear you. Karen.
We can't hear you.
Because I keep unmuting and then I get muted.
Remuting.
I get remuted. But that's one of the problems of writing in English. We keep getting remuted. What kinds of advantages do you think that writing in English gives you? I mean, it gives you perspective certainly on different your past, different experiences. Here, the experiences are much more dramatic in Israel, but there's a lot of advantage to writing in English for some.
Yeah.
What do you think?
I can answer. I think I started saying some of those things, but there are more. I think now that first of all, I live in Israel now, and it's funny, even like I hear it in my accent, like that it was, when I was reading the story now, I struggled a little more, reading, like pronouncing, when I was living in Canada, obviously, accent is a dynamic thing, as we, you probably know, Omer, when you're tired, your accent is stronger. If you're inebriated, your accent is stronger. So, so also being here it changes it. But I found it for me, when I came back to Israel, I was really worried about my English writing. I was worried that I was going to lose it. I'm like, that's it. I'm gonna be. I finally sort of, I got it, and now I'm gonna, I'm not gonna be as I'm not gonna have as fluency as I used to. That's something I really worried about. I realized then that it maintains the same sort of distance that before I had also by living abroad. Right? Because the distance is not just the language. When you live in Canada or in the US, as you do, Omer, you get the distance, the physical distance, the geographical distance, another, benefits, I think, to writing about Israel. Seeing it, דברים שרואים מכאן לא רואים משם kind of thing, and whatever. So I realized that by writing in English, I kind of managed to maintain that kind of distance. Even when I live here, I still have that one layer of it remaining. So that's one advantage. The other thing for me was, I felt like I sort of fled into it. I was, into English, and it gave me freedom, similarly, again, to the experience of immigration, where you can reinvent yourself. You can become a different person. You can become a different writer. You can say things you couldn't say before. You can be things you couldn't be before. And there is something to the fact that my mom doesn't read English. I have to say, that's a part of it when I'm talking about that. The freedom. But yeah, it felt, even though it's one of the most spoken languages in the world, to me it felt like a secret language. you know, like I felt like, yeah, like I could just be wild and take risks. And that was really appealing to me when I started writing in English. Yeah, I'll pass it on to you, Omer.
Yeah, I think I agree. And it's really interesting the kind of things you can do in English that are maybe blocked in Hebrew. And I think it's also not, I think it's not as simple as just writing in English, because our English is different from someone who grew up in America, for example.
Absolutely.
So we have some of the rhythms of Hebrew and some of the phrases which maybe sound a little strange to an American ear, but that's what also makes them, you know, a little different. And so I think it's not really letting go completely of Hebrew and of obviously with subject matter and writing about Israel, but also I think in terms of the rhythms of the language and making, because I think English, especially kind of a lot of these kind of post-colonial writers, Salman Rushdie, or who create a new kind of English that uses, you know, rhythms from other languages, words from other languages. So I think it makes it to me at least more interesting. It's not a choice of either this or that, but a kind of, okay, let's see what we can do with English that has a special kind of resonance of Hebrew to it.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. It's like infused with yeah. There's an anecdote I just have to share about Alexander Heyman, who's a Bosnian writer who writes in his second language. And I remember his wife read his work and said to him, "You can't, you know, about some phrase he used. She said, you can't say that in English." And he said, "You can now."
Yeah.
I love
yeah,
that.
you have you can kind of create new ways of
yeah.
Yeah.
Dare I ask you if you think differently? I mean, I know that you know I'm going to ask that, or someone's going to ask that. Thought about it. You think differently in Hebrew? Omer.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I do. I think sometimes when I'm with someone who doesn't speak Hebrew and I'm speaking to my parents or something, and I'm speaking in Hebrew, they say that it's like a different side of me, or so I think it's the language to me is in some ways more intimate because it's my mother tongue, and you know what I speak with my family and things like that. So maybe some of it is more connected to childhood for me, whereas English feels kind of like my adult language in some ways. I don't know. Yeah, it would be interesting if people, as they grew older, they changed language. They had a language for childhood, a language for adulthood, and a language for old age or something. But I think people do that with their. I think there's maybe, I mean, your vocabulary changes. I think it's the most interesting, I think, part of it is not really how you think, but actually in your dreams. I think my dreams in Hebrew are definitely different from my dreams in English. And it confuses me to wake up. If I have a dream in Hebrew and I wake up in New York, I'm always pretty confused.
You know what language it is? Because I don't know that I know that.
Sometimes I remember, sometimes I don't. Yeah.
Yeah.
Or even, I guess one of the weirder things is if you have a dream about friends who only speak Hebrew with you, and then they're speaking
And you're
English
speaking, yeah.
Right.
Because I wanted to say that for me, it feels like it's a great question, but it's not. It's very fluid. Like I consider myself made bilingual. Obviously, I wasn't born into it. I'm not as bilingual as my child, but the other day we were walking down the street and a neighbor ran into us and heard us, and she's like, "Oh, you speak English amongst yourselves?" And we looked at each other, was like, "Oh, we didn't notice." You know, we had no idea what language we were talking. So in a sense, it kind of fluidly shifts. And I feel like the dreams are like that too. I would speak Hebrew to people who speak English. Like half the dream doesn't have any language at all, and it just kind of we start sentences in this house in one language and finish in the other. And I'm sure a lot of you can relate to that, you know, as being maybe made bilingual yourselves. I can't really quantify it, you know. I'm sure there, yeah, I can't, I really can't, because I don't know that I think in a language, you know, or dream in a language. It's kind of a mix of words and in both languages, and images and feelings, and yeah. Mm-hmm.
Because you're both writing fiction, and I think both of you start with memoirs or memories. No, Ayelet, you started with memoirs. Oh no, I know.
No. The memoir was my second book, actually.
And actually, you began with poetry, right?
Me? Oh no.
Oh,
I wrote a
No
couple
poetry.
poems.
does fiction come first for you both?
Yeah.
And is the fiction always about Israel?
Okay. Did fiction come first? I have to say that my very first writing in English was actually nonfiction. That's because I was so intimidated by the idea. Fiction is my first love. I've written fiction as I've written fiction as a child. I've written a novel at the age of 15 that was never published, but I've always loved fiction. But then when I started writing in English, I was so intimidated by the idea of writing in fiction in English that nonfiction seemed like a good compromise at the time. It was like a new language for a new genre, or a new genre for a new language kind of thing. So I've never done that before, right? But I was like, okay, fine, I'll just write stories from my own life, because that seemed like easier for some reason. So that's what I did. And then I remember there was a snow day in Vancouver, which is a rare thing because Vancouver doesn't snow often, and the restaurant where I was working closed. And I ended up sitting at home and writing my first short story. And that was like, okay, I wrote a story in English. And after that, I moved strictly into fiction, and I wrote my book of fiction, The Best Place on Earth. And then I went back into memoir. Am I only writing about Israel? Mostly. And when I was away, when I was living in Canada, it was because partially because I missed it. Definitely because I could see more clearly, again, the distance, what a fascinating and rich and messed up place it is, which is such a fertile ground for fiction. But yeah, it's also, I think it was a chance for me to also almost visit it in my writing. It was like I would be sitting in the cold Toronto night writing about Eilat, and it was a joy for me. And I would say even more specifically for me, it's writing about Israel. It's usually writing about Mizrahi experience in Israel. People ask me, are you always going to write about Yemenis? And I'm like, so far, I'm not going to sign on something. I don't know what's gonna happen. Everything can change. Maybe I will write poetry. Who knows? But right now, this seems to still fascinate me and haunt me. So that's what I do. Yeah.
Omer and Ayelet, might I ask which language you count in? Because the linguists say that is your home language. Do you count in Hebrew or do you count in English?
Maybe it depends how high up we have to count.
Yeah, I don't know.
Depends how far you have to count. Which would you prefer to count in?
I honestly would do both. Depends who I'm with, or where I am.
Yeah. Going back to the question about fiction and nonfiction, there's this quote that Amos Oz said that I like, but he said that the word fiction doesn't really exist in Hebrew because it's siporet, which is more like a narrative prose, and fiction has a kind of ring of lying to it, or you're inventing something. And he says why is it considered lying or the opposite of truth when James Joyce counts or measures the steps between his house and the bar to get it right in his fiction, and when a nonfiction writer writes something that's more kind of cliche, like the melting pot of the Middle East or something, then it's considered true. So he talks about kind of the difference, I guess, between a kind of truth that you can get at through fiction rather than through kind of nonfiction or the cold facts or something. And I think that's always interested me because I'm kind of, in some of my stories at least, I like kind of blurring the boundaries between something that's a little more fantastical and something that's more realist, and kind of create stories that are weird and sometimes absurd or a little magical in some ways. But I think it's also a way of sometimes getting at a kind of truth, even if it's an emotional truth rather than something that's actually historically accurate. But so I guess I'm interested in those questions. I haven't really written that much nonfiction, some essays and things. But I find it hard, I think, to write directly about myself and my experiences. So I think fiction, the distance of it, like the distance of English as a language for me, actually helps me write something that's more intimate, because I can sort of invent characters and situations, but get at sort of emotional truths that are more intimate to me, and all the feelings that my characters feel, I felt in some way, even if it's disguised a little bit.
Certainly Joyce needed that perspective as well. There are people, I have to tell you, there are people who want to ask you questions, and they have all turned to Michael because he is fielding the questions, and Michael has is full of questions for you. And I'm going to turn the evening over to Michael, who will be asking everyone's questions. And I hope maybe I'll have a chance to ask some too at the end. But first.
So that was wonderful. And I have a question here from Erica. It's prompted by Omer's comments, opening comments about fitting in the scene in New York. Could Omer and Ayelet comment further on the reception of their very Israeli work in the broader Anglophone literary community, beyond Jewish press and Jewish awards and Jewish expats and Jewish Israeli, how does the general non-Jewish public or non-Israeli public accept your work?
Yeah, I mean, I think I did want the stories to to be approachable to anyone, not necessarily only Israelis or only Jews. And I think there's this kind of, I mean, some of the work that I like the most, and I think this is true for Ayelet's work and writers like Jhumpa Lahiri, who have a very kind of micro, like kind of local zooming in of a place, but it feels very universal. So I think that's kind of the work that I like the most. So I'm hoping that, yeah, it resonates with other, other audiences. I think, yeah, I think it's interesting, and mostly to hear the kind of either reviews or the questions from sort of critics or audiences that aren't necessarily Jewish or Israeli. And I think a lot of it is the focus in a way on the political, whereas maybe from an Israeli audience, the politics is kind of a given in a way. And so we can sort of see a bit deeper and not kind of resort only to these kinds of questions that flatten the work and make it only into this kind of thing that's about the situation or something like that. And you can kind of, I think, look at the different aspects and the different facets of the work that aren't only political, because I think a lot of Israeli writers face that kind of challenge of their work is sometimes, flattened into only, this is only about politics, and what's your stance on this, and what do you think of that? And I think obviously maybe there is, a kind of there is something we have to keep in mind when we're writing, but I think the goal isn't to convince anyone of anything, obviously, and you're not kind of writing a political manifesto, but you're creating characters and complex situations. So I guess that was my experience sometimes with the non-Jewish or non-Israeli audiences, is the focus tended to be a little bit more on the political. I don't know if you had that too, Ayelet.
This is something I was really worried about before I wrote the book. When I first started to write in English, I didn't write about Israel so much. I was, I think I wanted to, and I was scared. I thought, yeah, like it's going to be perceived as political. It's going to be like I'm going to be inundated with questions about politics. I'm like, I didn't want to touch that, at all. But first of all, like we said before, it wasn't much of a choice writing in English. It's also not really much of a choice, the topics and the stories and the characters and the voices that do end up on the page. At least for me, it's a lot of it is just, it just happens. And it was very clear to me at one point that this is what I needed to write. This is what I was driven to write, compelled to write. And I need to be brave and take the risk and write what I really want to write my truth, like you said, in fiction. One of the quotes that I loved at the time, and I still love, is the one by Cynthia Ozick, who says that when you blow into the narrow end of the shofar, you will, like, I forgot it now. If you blow into the narrow end of the shofar, you're not going to be heard. But if you blow into you will be heard far. But if you blow into the wide one, because you want to be mankind and not be Jewish and not be Israeli and not be you, then you're not going to be heard at all. That's what it was. And that quote to me was really monumental. I was like, okay, I can't please everyone. I can't, I just have to do me. And I have to write my truth, and I have to write the stories that speak to me and the stories that haunt me. And that's what I do. Thank you, Mark. If we blow into the narrow end of the shofar, we will be heard far. But if we choose to be mankind rather than Jewish, we will not be heard at all.
So as a professional shofar blower myself.
So you attest to it being true?
Yeah, absolutely true. I can attest to that. Our organization is the Israeli Association of Writers in English. And I think everybody, unless I'm mistaken, but I think everybody in the organization are immigrants who have come to live in Israel, who write in English, their mother language, and we form an organization to hold them and to promote them and to help them find a home. You're both back in Israel. Are you seen as betraying your language, like you're Israelis writing in English? Do you want to become members of our organization? Are you going back to write in Hebrew? Are you, how does that work? How do Israelis see you? Have they read your work in Hebrew? Has it been translated? There must be a tension there.
Yeah, there is. Omer actually lives in New York. For me, yeah, I actually wanted to, first of all, I do want to be a part of your organization. And I am very upset that I have not heard of it until now. It's perfect. I need to be a part of it. That said, yes, there is, like, I think what Omer said before, it was like, here I'm also a bit of an outsider because I am, Israeli born. This is my mother tongue. And then, in Israel, I have friends, I have like a writing community here. I have a literary community, but I am different. I write in English, so I am on the fringes of that as well. And when my book was translated into Hebrew, I was worried again, just like I was worried before I was writing it in English, whether it would speak to the audiences abroad. Now I was worried that the Israeli audience is not going to find it authentic, which again speaks to our need to belong, to our need to be, considered a part of something. And I'm like, are people going to read this and say, she got it wrong? What does she know? She lives in Canada, So it's kind of a constant battle, which is, I'm not complaining about it because I think this is what inspires so much of my work. Probably all of it, this is it. This is that wanting to belong, that living in between, in liminal spaces, between languages, between identities, between places. This is, I live for it and in it.
Yeah, I think that's really, really great way to put it. It's a kind of in between space, and I don't know. It's weird, the languages that my book is being translated into. It's not the ones that I expected. It's coming out in Turkish in a bit, and it came out in Dutch, Italian and Slovak or something. So it's a bit strange, but not Hebrew for now.
It took me a while too. I have to say.
Yeah,
it was a while. Other languages were first.
Yeah, and I think we talked about it. Yeah, but the kind of selling coals to Newcastle thing. I don't know. But I think, yeah, like if it happened, if like her work and mine is also translated, then I would also kind of it would be a different kind of worry than it was here, and it would be interesting. But we'll see what happens.
We have a complaint here. There is a complaint by someone who says that you use too much Hebrew in your writing. I haven't read your writing, I have to admit, but it's not me. And wishes that there was a glossary of words.
Omer or me or both?
Oh, Omer, slicha. Omer.
Oh yeah.
Slicha.
There are words that you use, Omer, that only mean something in Hebrew without a glossary, like Zachen or Luftgeschäft. I mean, there are words that if you translate them, they lose everything. So
I agree.
Using this is the place that seems most problematic. That place that gets lost in any kind of translation when you there are words in Yiddish that you can't use in any other language. There's words in Yemeni that you can't translate.
Mhm.
And I think that whatever the complaint was, it's got to stay a complaint, because these are you're bringing out a culture that is within that cannot be translated. there are things in your background that cannot be translated into other languages. But do you write about New York at all, Omer?
Not yet. I think it is interesting about having the Hebrew words in there. I think, yeah, I think I was sort of thinking or worried about writing a book that would feel, like Ayelet said, inauthentic, or that would feel like some kind of tourist guide to Israel, and I didn't want that kind of work. So I think it is a balance. I mean, you want the non-Hebrew speaking audiences to understand, maybe through context, maybe some words, they'll miss here and there, but I think I'd prefer that to a book that feels too, I don't know, kind of pandering maybe to a different audience, but keeping a kind of, some of the authenticity, and that includes the language, I guess. But no, I haven't I haven't written about New York yet, and I'm not sure I will. I think, like, there's enough going on in Israel to keep us writing for years. Never boring. So
our audience is surprised in America. Our audience is surprised when you reveal yourself as Israelis, because you don't sound like Israelis. You're accentless. I mean, you don't have thick Israeli accents. I mean, it's pretty good. I mean, you can get away with being almost native, native not here, native there. Are people then surprised? Whoa, you're Israelis?
It varies. There were people who could send, and like I said, my accent is thicker now, but it varied. There were people who knew right away, they heard it. People with better ears, maybe, and there are others who were like, "Oh wow, we're sure you were, born here." There were other responses though, right? Like people who assume that Israelis look a certain way or Jews look a certain way, or were confused by my Yemeni identity, or it was all like, just there's a lot of ignorance around that, which is a part of what I was, I guess hoping to change a little bit with my books, really, writing about a different kind of Jewishness than what most Americans know, or Canadians, and expect.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I guess it's a good disguise sometimes. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I wonder sometimes actually if a very thick accent would be a better kind of shield, actually, because sometimes you can hide behind it a little. But
I hear
you.
I know this is changing the subject, but perhaps you would like to read a little more. Would you like to read something else, Ayelet and Omer? Because we'd love to hear you in the accent.
I have to leave in about 7 minutes, but I have a paragraph that I can read that I quite like. If you allow me, it's from the title story. I'll find it. And it's a story that takes place in Hornby Island in Vancouver, near Vancouver. Two sisters, one lives there and one is coming to visit her from Jerusalem. And give me 1 sec. There we go. After breakfast, she asked to use the computer to check the news. Please don't, Tamal said. You're on vacation. She had stopped reading news from Israel years ago. She said it's all bad anyway. Naomi turned on the computer, typing in Ynet's URL. A pigua in Jerusalem. 10 injured, nobody dead. For a moment, you could see how her country might look to a Canadian, how Jerusalem could be perceived as the worst place to live.
raise a family, a dangerous, troubled city torn between faith, a hotbed for fanatics and fundamentalists. 10 years ago, on their visit to Vancouver, Naomi and Ami had asked Tamal to take them out. They had been younger then, intoxicated by the sense of freedom new parents experienced on their first vacation away from their child. Let's party all night, Ami said. This isn't Jerusalem. There's no all night here. Tamal said, well, that sucks. Maybe, but it's also safe and civilized. Safe, Ami scoffed. Overrated. They all laughed. Later, he said to Naomi, maybe people in Vancouver don't party as much because their lives are too comfortable. You know, the whole drink, dance, and be merry because tomorrow you might die kind of thing. Maybe there's something good about knowing it could all end at any minute. She had thought he was being morbid, but now it made sense. She was so used to living in a constant state of urgency, verging on emergency. No wonder the quiet made her uneasy. She looked at the screen. Israeli soldiers and paramedics frozen in mid-action, their faces grim and alert. A carcass of a car, broken pieces of twisted metal, dark stain on asphalt. She didn't miss this, yet she couldn't even fathom living anywhere else. It's too much, Tamal had said to her on her last visit. It's just too intense for me. She was right, Naomi had thought. Sometimes it was too much. She loved and hated Jerusalem, a city that would forever be contested, forever divided, never at peace. But there was more to Jerusalem than what one saw in the news, like how beautiful it was. Not in the way BC was, but in a hard, raw, and broken way. How it felt alive, a kind of beast, pulsating, breathing, vibrating under her feet. How sometimes when she walked through the old city and saw tourists snapping photos and looking at everything with awe, she would see Jerusalem through their eyes and be reminded that people used to walk there 2,000 years ago in togas, and it would make her feel small and insignificant, but in a good way. How at times the city truly felt sacred, magical, the center of everything. Like at sunset, when the sun reflected crimson and gold on the limestone, and the dome of the rock shone like a rare amber in the middle of the city. Or on a winter night when it snowed and everything was briefly muted and still, the sharp edges softened. Or how on Friday evenings, when the buses disappeared into the jaws of Central Station to park for Shabbat, and the Hasidic neighborhoods blocked their roads from traffic, and everywhere smelled of home-cooked dinners. It felt like the most peaceful city in the world, the best place on earth. Thank you.
That was beautiful.
Thank you.
I can read a little bit from a story called The Sephardi Survivor. It's about two brothers who are Sephardi, and they're very jealous of their classmates who have relatives that are Holocaust survivors. So they kidnap an old man and pretend he's their grandfather for Memorial Day. So I'll read a little bit of that. When the competitions were held at school, the grandfathers and grandmothers were paraded around like slow-moving trophy dogs. Look at that one, Zoal said, pointing at Clara Kugelmas's grandmother, a tiny elderly lady with rouged lips and a purple cane. He nudged Yuda in the ribs. Not bad looking, eh? Yechezkel Yankelovich brought in two survivors, double trouble, twin sisters with matching silver braids, who had been experimented on by Dr. Mengele. Dana Davidson brought in her grandfather's second cousin, a beanpole who had testified at Eichmann's trial. The best survivors of all were so shrunken, they were almost pocket-sized. They were carried around from event to event, pulled out at the last minute and used as excuses for not completing homework on time. I'm sorry I couldn't study because I was listening to my grandfather's Shoah story was a common reason for failing a math test. Our sworn enemy was Matan Mordechai Mendelbaum, who always had the best Shoah story. His grandfather was not only a survivor, he was also a respected historian, a world specialist in the field whose books on the Shoah had won awards and prizes. The Mendelbaum home was filled with shelves of his books, translated into dozens of different languages, all with swastikas on the cover. I imagined all the Mendelbaums sitting together at the breakfast table, picking at crusts of baguette and expensive smoked salmon, quoting their favorite parts of Schindler's List to each other. And I was so jealous I wanted to wring Matan Mordechai Mendelbaum's neck. Thankfully, the Elvis of the Holocaust, as Mendelbaum frequently referred to his grandfather, didn't live in Israel. My brother and I would have surely lost if he were coming to class to tell his story. I'll stop there.
You guys, you've killed me. My grandson, I have a grandson named Omer, and if you're interested, let me just notify you that next month our guest is Robert Pinsky. And then in 2 months, we're going to, Sarah Sassoon is going to talk to Roni Somek about.
Oh, wonderful.
We're going to have a lot of interlingual things. And I hope that you will be able to join us. We have, because you're great. You guys are great. It's great fun. I'm sure that this is the beginning of a great friendship for all of us. So I know there are more questions, but I wonder if we can do this in correspondence, because I think many of them are very repetitious, and Ayelet has, I know that you have to leave and you're being very polite.
Yes.
So, thank you very much.
Canadianness.
Wonderful, wonderful evening. And thank you to all the audience who managed to get through all my scheduling mistakes. Thank you. And now that my necklace is gone, we will end the evening and hope to see you next month.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Ayelet.
Bye. Bye, Omer. Toda.
Bye.
You can go off mute and thank our speakers if you want.
And you can
Yes. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Very
Thanks so much. Wonderful.
Bye.
Thank you. Good night, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye.